This is Military Matters. I'm Rod Rodriguez. Last year, around this time, the United States, its allies, and private citizens and organizations took part in the largest humanitarian evacuation in history. As Afghanistan fell back to Taliban control, the world was shocked by images of desperate Afghans handing small babies to Marines over razor wire, and people trying to hold on desperately to landing gear as military planes took to the skies, and the video of them falling to their deaths. We covered the evacuation of Afghan partners and allies over several episodes, and I'd highly encourage you to go back and listen to the CIA and the Afghan evacuation, as well as our story on Task Force Pineapple. But this week, we're re-releasing our story on Operation Save Our Allies. Our guests, Chad Robichaux, Nick Palmisciano, and the diplomats Catherine Putz, take us into the story of a broken immigrant visa program, a high-stakes rescue mission, and the tragic story of how a busload of orphans were left behind. On this one-year anniversary of the events you're about to hear about, we also want to take a moment to remember the lives of the service members who died on August 26th last year during a bombing at the Kabul airport. This story is still an important story a year later as our country continues to deal with the ramifications of leaving Afghanistan, the price we've paid, and the lives of those who remain now in a Taliban-controlled country. Thousands of Afghans fled their country as the Taliban resumed control after a decade-long fight with the United States and the Afghan government. Back home, veterans received phone calls, emails, and texts from desperate Afghan friends and allies asking for any help to leave the country before the Taliban found them. Did a broken State Department immigrant visa program contribute to the chaos? Who were these veterans flying Afghans out of the country? And did ego cost the lives of orphans and other refugees? I'm Rod Rodriguez.
I'm Jack Murphy.
This is Military Matters.
Those incredible people that have worked for so long on our endless war in Afghanistan, 19 years, going on 20 years. And there hasn't been a moment like this. We've had very successful negotiations. We think they'll be successful in the end. The other side's tired of war. Everybody's tired of war.
In February of 2020, then President Trump announced a peace deal with the Taliban. This deal would require U.S. troops to withdraw by the thousands over the next several months, with a complete withdrawal scheduled for 14 months from the signing. It would include a Taliban-Afghan troop prisoner swap and require that the Taliban commit to, quote, preventing other groups, including al-Qaeda, from using Afghan soil to recruit, train, or fundraise toward activities that threaten the United States or its allies. After President Biden, a longtime critic of U.S. presence in Afghanistan, was sworn in, he doubled down on the previous administration's commitment and held fast to the withdrawal. The country seemed at first to be somewhat torn between leaving and staying. Some argued that enough blood had been shed and that it was time for our troops to come home, that it was time for the Afghan government to stand on its own. Others felt like our withdrawal was tantamount to abandoning a wartime ally, and that the collapse of the Afghan government was inevitable. Paired with a often described as broken State Department-run Afghan special immigrant visa program, that a full withdrawal would result in a humanitarian crisis. Much of this debate came to a head as cell phone footage surfaced shot on the Kabul airport tarmac, showing the desperation of hundreds, if not thousands, of Afghans who had breached the airport perimeter, running alongside military aircraft, some clinging onto the retracting landing gear, and others trying to hold on to anything on the outside of the planes as they flew away. The world was shocked as we all saw video of Afghans falling to their deaths from these planes, people who would rather die than return to Taliban rule. While the world gasped in shock, some argued about who was responsible: Trump, Biden, Congress, the generals, or they simply scrolled up on their social media feed trying to find something less depressing. But then there were those who decided they wouldn't just stand by and let this happen. Those men and women were veterans and their supporters who had served in Afghanistan, some for years working alongside their Afghan partners who were now desperately trying to find a way out of the country before the Taliban took over completely. The story of this mass evacuation really starts years before we would broker a deal with the Taliban. You see, almost every one of the veterans we spoke to about the friend or ally they tried to help out of Afghanistan was at some point in the Afghan Special Immigrant Visa process, a State Department program charged with helping Afghans legally find ways out of their country and into the U.S. A version of this program was approved by Congress in 2009 through the Afghan Allies Protection Act and has gone through numerous revisions and amendments, as each administration has had a say in how it's run. This program was brought up over and over again as a point of frustration for veterans who, for one, had been working their Afghan partner's visa for 6 years. Now, this program was supposed to be a simple 4-step process to help qualified Afghans who had been employed by or on behalf of the U.S. government attain visas. In a country that was technologically challenged, the entire process was supposed to be done electronically. If the State Department had a question or required an additional document, it was done over email. The applicant was required to supply a verification letter from the employer's HR or Human Resources Department, a letter of recommendation from a direct or senior supervisor, a statement of threat they received as a consequence of their employment with the U.S. government, a completed DS-157 form, which is the application itself, and evidence of their Afghan nationality. Once this packet was thoroughly reviewed, they were required to travel to the U.S. Embassy in Kabul for an in-person review. This process often took more than a year to complete, and since 2014, approximately 16,000 Afghan visas have been issued. That's a little over 2,000 a year on average since 2014.
As of December 2019 or 2019, I believe it was, there was 18,000 applications somewhere in the process.
That's Catherine Putz. She's the managing editor of The Diplomat, where she's been covering Afghanistan for 7 years and has written extensively on the Afghan SIV program.
And that's more than there were available visas. So that sort of gives a picture of the number of people who knew they were in the process, but didn't know if they would get a visa. And so when it came to people rushing to the airport to try to get through, it does not surprise me that it was such a mess, because a lot of people believed that they were eligible, but their visas hadn't been adjudicated yet. And the ability to do that was just nil once the embassy in Kabul had to sort of put all effort into evacuating people instead of conducting visa interviews.
But 16,000 issued visas doesn't sound bad, right? I mean, at least 16,000 made it. But how many were authorized to be issued versus the 16,000 that were?
The total number of visas allocated since December 2014 is 34,000. So a number of those have been allocated already, but that's the max number authorized so far. So, on the one hand, the State Department never totally fulfilled the number of visas in a given year, but there were points in time, I believe it was 2017, after a number of visas finally cleared the system. Because again, the State Department doesn't control the entire process. So they do their part of it, and then somebody might be stuck in DHS processing or Defense Department. And once those visas clear, that deducts from the cap. And I think the number of available visas went as low as 500 that year. And so that slowed the process down. When you have thousands of people in the application process and you only have a pool of 500 visas, there's a tension between how many do you process at any given time, and are we going to get more next year? Because we don't know. And so, I think this points to one of the key problems, which is the US government does not know how many Afghans are actually eligible for this program. So nobody knows what the total number should ever be. And in an ideal world, we would know how many Afghans are actually eligible for this program, allocate that number of visas, and then just work on the process. Because you don't know that answer, it becomes a little bit of a sort of balancing act, but you don't know how much weight is on the other end of the scale.
So less than half of the total number of authorized visas were granted, 18,000 in the pipeline, with Afghans unsure of where they were in the process. And the State Department doesn't even really know how many Afghans even qualify for this program. Then there's the question of who qualifies. You see, the Afghan SIV program lists two types of qualifiers: those who were employed in Afghanistan by or on behalf of the U.S. government in Afghanistan, or by the International Security Assistance Force, or ISAF, or a successor mission, in a capacity that required the applicant to serve as an interpreter or translator for U.S. military personnel while traveling off base with U.S. military personnel stationed at ISAF, or to perform activities for the U.S. military personnel stationed at ISAF. So you were either employed by the U.S. government or you were an interpreter translator working for ISAF for the U.S. government. I get it. Translators and interpreters are definitely targets of retribution and reprisal if the Taliban came back into power, or even when they weren't. These folks were still targets, as were their families. What about Afghan military members or Afghan commandos who weren't employed by the United States, but were instead serving their country alongside U.S. forces, and many other types of occupations that supported U.S. efforts but were not directly employed by the U.S. government? Well, they simply didn't qualify.
When it comes to Afghans who were trained by the Americans, but they were employed by the Afghan government, there wasn't a provision within any of this for those people, even though they ostensibly have the same kind of risks as, say, somebody who was employed for a contractor doing agricultural work. You know, the risk factor is relation to the United States. The Taliban doesn't care if you were being paid by Uncle Sam, if you're being paid by the Afghan government, who was being paid by Uncle Sam. So the risk remained the same, but the legislation was very carefully written to sort of carve out specific groups of Afghans who would qualify.
In our previous Fast Take, Kabul Embassy, the Taliban, and the Fall of Afghanistan, former Special Forces member and U.S. intelligence contractor Daniel told us about seeing members of the Afghan military, especially their Special Forces commandos, being targeted by an emblazoned Taliban during the late stages of the U.S. withdrawal. It's no secret that senior military officials had briefed the president that without U.S. presence and support, that the Afghan military was not ready to fight or defend the country from the Taliban. Estimates for how long the Afghan military would last without U.S. support ranged from weeks to months. Some saw it happen in real time, in just days. So why wouldn't the SIV program be designed to help our allies or be modified to assist those we knew were going to be targeted? Afghans who didn't work for us but certainly worked alongside us, took our direction, advice, and guidance, and most importantly, trusted us to support them.
There seems to have been no real forethought about what that would mean for not just people directly employed by the U.S. government, but those trained by the U.S. government and sort of forever associated with the U.S. government. There's just one thing I wanted to add to that, is that I think there were also political concerns when it came to the Afghan government. You know, if the Afghan government is, or the Afghan government that was under the Ghani administration was an ally of the United States, you know, offering visas for its army and its air force to leave the country while it was ostensibly still in control, I think created a tension that was hard to overcome. How do you say to an ally, we support you, but here's a fast track for your forces to leave because it's, you know, not safe for them in the country. And you know, I don't know that there's an easy answer to that.
In addition to the hurdles an Afghan had to face with simply qualifying for an SIV, there's the stigma of being from Afghanistan and being an immigrant. There was undoubtedly anxiety concerning the number of Afghans being allowed into the country and properly vetting those people. No lawmaker wanted a terrorist action performed by someone who had gone through the SIV program, a program they had voted for or petitioned to be expanded. There was a burden of proof placed on the Afghan applicant to prove they weren't bad. But this could be especially difficult when the country, for the most part, doesn't facilitate keeping accurate electronic records. They may only have paper documents that need to be scanned, or the business they worked for that they need that HR document from doesn't exist any longer. Throw in an often dangerous and expensive trip to the capital, and suddenly 18,000 applicants in the chute looks like an extremely small percentage of people that might have qualified. Catherine also points to reports from the Office of the Inspector General, which outlined the results of a review of the SIV program. These reports were publicly but quietly filed away. You can Google it, but it's something you have to know even exists to know to look for it. One of the reports is a short management review, and the other is a full review. They offer a snapshot of what had been happening at the State Department for some time. These reports discuss issues concerning the lack of available manpower dedicated to the program. In October of 2019, 12 of the 37 positions at the Kabul Embassy's consular section were vacant.
So the people who should be doing the paperwork and scheduling the interviews and adjudicating these visas, they weren't there. And in 2019, the State Department reduced staff. So the number of actual consular officers at the embassy in Kabul, the number of consular officers declined from 5 to 3. So it's not shocking that fewer people were unable to do more work.
The OIG assessed there were 8 obstacles hindering the SIV process, 2 of which did not significantly affect the program, but those obstacles include staffing issues, interagency delays, documentation requirements, and the lack of a centralized database. Catherine also pointed to an interesting but telling piece of the report found in a footnote. You see, the report states that those obstacles exist because the position of senior coordinating official intended to oversee and direct the Afghan SIV program had been vacant since January of 2017. The State Department responded to the recommendation that this position be filled by saying that the position was in fact 2 different positions and that they were both filled.
There's a footnote in that part of the report that says that, when they were doing field work and writing and putting together this report, no State Department officials told the OIG that these were 2 different positions and that they were filled. Now, reading through that, what that said to me was, if nobody knows who's in charge of a process, how can that process be efficiently run? If nobody knows who's responsible, is it really a priority? And that to me is sort of the underlying theme of certainly the responses from the officials, the State Department officials, to the recommendations. When the OIG said, you should assess the staffing levels, the response was like, sure, we'll assess the staffing levels, but if it's inadequate, that's going to be a matter for budget and competing priorities, which to me said this is not a top priority. So, we could assign more people to this, but we probably won't.
So based on all of this, you're probably thinking that the issue is the State Department. As we'll discuss later in the story, they weren't the easiest organization to coordinate with during the evacuations, and they are certainly cemented in bureaucracy, but the blame for how slow the process was, the manning, the budget, the number of visas authorized, well, it's not just their fault exactly.
Yeah, so I think it's very easy to peg the State Department with the blame for why this process didn't work. But if you look at the reasons that I identified for why this is such a difficult process, the number of visas available, the State Department staffing, the guidelines for eligibility, none of that is actually the State Department's responsibility to determine. They have to implement what Congress gives them. And so if Congress only provides 4,000 additional visas, as they did in 2018, State Department has to work with that. And that has cascading effects on how many visa applications were processed. Because if you only have an additional 4,000, but you've got a queue of 18,000, the math doesn't work. And so I think definitely does not absolve the State Department of responsibility for its part in this. they don't get to make the rules. They have to follow the rules that the legislation lays out for them. And it's the legislation is where it's lacking. So much of this process was put on the embassy in Kabul, which was responsible for a lot more than just the SIV process. And so when it comes to prioritization, consular officers, for example, at the embassy in Afghanistan, they have a lot of responsibilities. The SIV interviews are just one aspect of that job. And so I think when it comes to apportioning blame, it should be cast much more broadly than just the State Department. This was a failure with many responsible parties.
The obstacles identified in the OIG report on the Afghan SIV program, the bureaucratic failures, lack of personnel, and generally bad assessments of the Afghan situation foreshadowed the chaos that would ensue as U.S. forces quickly began leaving their once permanent bases. Images flooded the news of Taliban wearing ballistic armor, carrying rifles with optics, riding around in vehicles confiscated from the Afghan military, a military we had trained and equipped. While the Taliban paraded in the streets and played like children on gym equipment abandoned by U.S. forces, families all over the country were desperately trying to figure out what to do next. The SIV program wasn't an option anymore. They couldn't wait for an interview. They couldn't wait for someone to send them an email. The time for paperwork was over. They knew the Taliban would come for them. They knew the Americans had left them. The Taliban were quickly closing in on Afghan soldiers, police, judges, and across the country, it had suddenly become dangerous once again to be a little girl or a woman. Then, like something straight out of a movie, a few veterans with a particular set of skills decided enough was enough. They were going to take matters into their own hands and get their friends and allies out of Afghanistan, no matter what. More after the break.
Any hopes for the Afghan government to hold out against the Taliban for weeks or months fell apart when the Afghan president Ashraf Ghani fled the country on August 15th. When the president of your country flees, there's not much hope for the people of the country left behind. With the president gone, the military crumbling, and the Taliban now inside the city of Kabul, the window for escaping the country was quickly closing on everyone.
And my immediate reaction is, I have to go get my friend. And so I started working a plan. Dan Stinson and I started working a plan to go get Aziz and his wife and his 6 kids. We raised some money and put a team together of about 12 former special operations guys. And as we're putting the team together, we're watching this thing deteriorate in Afghanistan. We're like, this is going to be bigger than Aziz.
That's Chad Robichaw. He's a former recon Marine and the CEO of Mighty Oaks Foundation. He was one of many veterans following along closely to what can only be described as the fall of Afghanistan. As the news reported worsening conditions, his thoughts were to his friend Aziz and his family.
He literally saved my life numerous times, saved my friends' lives numerous times, saved so many Americans' lives by his actions in that job. I mean, this guy, like, if we're in the mountains of Afghanistan or in a Taliban-infested village, if it was in the middle of the night and I had to walk around a corner, he would never let me walk around that corner first. He was always going to go first and protect me, keep me safe. And he's just an amazing human being. When I wasn't operating with him, I didn't go back on a base somewhere. I went to his home and I ate dinner with his family and played soccer with his kids. So over these 8 deployments, I became very close to Aziz. He became, my brother, my friend. I love him. And through the years after Afghanistan, I stayed in touch with him. And for the last 6 years, myself and a teammate of mine, Dan Stinson, have been trying to get his SIV visa. And it's just a broken system, especially for those interpreters that worked in the special operations community who didn't have a traditional contract with the government.
So I was literally in Austin, Texas, sitting next to Tim Kennedy.
That's Nick Palmisciano. He's a former infantry officer and the CEO of Ranger Up. When he got this call, he was actually working on a book with former UFC fighter and U.S. Army Reserve Special Forces Master Sergeant Tim Kennedy.
I get a text message from Sarah Verardo, who is the CEO of the Independence Fund, asking me whether I'd be willing to go to Afghanistan to help. At the same time that Tim Kennedy gets a text from Chad Robichaw asking if he's willing to go to Afghanistan to help. And then shortly thereafter, Chad hits me up. And so we're sitting next to each other going, what the hell is going on here?
Chad's on the phone calling other folks he knew from the special operations community who are also following the Afghan crisis closely.
So my level of awareness was high. I was helping out a little bit with like Adam DeMarco and the guys at Allied Airlift 2021. I was passing messages to people, doing what most veterans were doing. So this was at the very beginning of everything. The walls were closing around Kabul. And, so like we're sitting next to each other and, I'm like, what do you think? And Tim, of course, is always like, yeah, if we have a mission, like we don't want to go over there and just hang out and say like, hey, we were there. A gentleman that served with Chad by the name of Dan Stinson had linked up with his buddy, a guy by the name of Joe Robert. And Joe grew up with some high-level folks in our host country. And basically, they said, if you guys come over here, we're going to give you 2 C-17s to use. We actually also were able to get 3 737s. So, just like that, it became real.
Chad Robichaud.
And so we went to the UAE government because we had some relationships there in our team with the royal family, and we asked for support. And they amazingly came back with more support than we expected to get. They gave us an airfield, 2 C-17 planes, an airstrip to land from, to take off from, let us set up a joint operations center on their base in Abu Dhabi, and gave us access to a humanitarian center staffed with, everything you could imagine, doctors and social workers and counselors and, medicine, food, everything you can imagine to take care of these people, and for 4,100 beds.
36 hours after that first call, Tim and I are on a plane to UAE. They pick us up at the airport, like folks from the UAE military, and they bring us to essentially the equivalent of of our building 4, if that means anything to you, of where infantry officers get training. But theirs is like marble and is gorgeous, and there's ponds running through it, and it's catered, and it's amazing. And I'm like, man, these guys do it right. But they give us a whole jock to use.
What Nick is referencing here is a JOC, or a Joint Operations Center. This is what the military would refer to as a hub where decision makers and planners work from to enable operations to take place.
Not that we spent a ton of time there at first, because about 2 hours after we landed in UAE, dropped our shit off in our room, we were driving to the airport, a different airport, to fly to HKIA. So Tim and I take an empty plane there. A ground forces dude basically pushes up a ladder to the edge, like a rolling staircase to the edge of the plane. And we walk off this ladder and hop in, whatever the hell they're not M Gators, but whatever the new faster one is. We get on one of those and we start driving like under moving planes because we just have to get somewhere fast. And I'm like, this is wild.
While Nick and Tim are speeding through an airport tarmac, Chad and the rest of his crew are putting together a plan to help as many Afghans get to safety as possible. But they're well aware that whatever they do, they have to ensure that people they are helping don't break any rules that would make them ineligible for help, or worse, get them turned away. So despite the broken nature of the SIV process, it's still the best shot for a better life for the Afghan refugees. And some of them are already at some stage in the SIV process. So Chad's trying hard to find ways to help them essentially keep their position in the State Department's queue.
Well, if you look at the State Department's website, the State Department says that they could get to another country then they could apply they can continue the application for SIV visas, P1, P2 visas. And so based on the State Department's rules, you simply have to get them to another country. There's lots of laws and that could get you in trouble if you don't do it right. So you have to abide by those laws. So you have to do it legally and ethically. And I'm proud to say that we actually have. Everything we've done, we have done legally and ethically. And with cooperation of the Joint Chiefs, the DOD and State Department, OFAC is through the Treasury Department to make sure you're doing things correct. And so we've been following all the rules to do that. And that's very important because I don't want to go to jail. I don't want anybody on our team to go to jail. And we don't want these people that we did get out to be sent back because it was done the wrong way. And so it's very complicated. And it's also while we have been working with the State Department and Joint Chiefs, they have not been the easiest people to work with in this because there's a lot of mistakes made in the evacuation. The State Department's never done NEO operation before. They're not equipped to. And so what happened when the State Department was given that NEO operation, they held the airport like an embassy and treated it like an embassy, meaning it's like the military is now working for the State Department and they're security guards. They can't leave. They go help troops. They have to hold a static perimeter. And we were told that we held the airport and we were holding the airport. The truth is the United States was never in control of that airport. The Taliban was given the outer perimeter, and anybody that knows military strategy knows whoever owns the outer perimeter owns the ground space. Taliban controlled that airport from the day the State Department was given that NEO operation.
So a NEO operation is a non-combatant evacuation operation. The U.S. military has been training for this since the 1980s and 1990s, and they've executed a number of these missions over the decades. It is usually where the Marine Corps or some other rapid reaction force component of the United States military is spun up quickly to evacuate U.S. citizens from a foreign country. And so this happens in places like Lebanon. We did one of these in Liberia. We did a few of these in Libya in recent years. To some extent, it has happened in Iraq and Yemen as well, where the U.S. military will have to mobilize soldiers and assets to evacuate American citizens from a country that is collapsing or experiencing some sort of turmoil. Usually, this is in the context of a U.S. embassy evacuation. So here we have the problem that the State Department is running what ostensibly should be a U.S. military NEO operation. And some people had complaints about this, but the State Department still had the lead on the entire thing throughout. In the meantime, you had the Taliban controlling the outer perimeter of the airfield in Kabul, which meant that had to be secured. And, the enemy kind of was at the gates throughout the duration of this entire mission. Nick and Tim finally arrive and link up with other members of their group.
And basically what we did was, we split off into groups. We had 4 guys, Seaspray, G, Tim, and another gentleman that were spending most of their time running outside the wire, grabbing people. And then there were 4 of us that were on HKIA, basically talking to gates, talking to the task force, throwing people on planes, making sure that the guys outside the gate were taken care of. And then there were 4 guys that were running out of the host country that were building manifests and talking to DC. And, we were connected to the Joint Chiefs of Staff for getting manifests approved. And so I tell everybody, like, it was one of those things where it's like, hey, will you go? And I said yes. And there were 11 other guys just like me. Everybody except for, Kennedy and Seaspray are there with dad bods. Like, it's not like a bunch of badasses, we worked our asses off. I mean, like nonstop for 10 days, just nonstop, like a ranger school exercise. Like, there was just no time. You were catching naps, whenever there was like a lull in anything.
Chad Robichaw.
90% of us had careers in special operations. So, and still connected in, doing work at OGA, at the CIA and government contracts and still working with these. So we're very connected to the community. So obviously that's a network of knowing people. So there was that. we're that far removed to where we didn't have those relationships still in place. Secondly, while the military as a whole, the DOD, was probably not a popular thing with us being there and helping, you had to imagine the frustration on the ground to the guys, our service members. They're on this base, the airport. They know American citizens are fighting to get in. They want to go help. They're not allowed to. They're watching the Germans. They're watching the British. They're watching the French go out and get their people when they can't. They are, they're military men and women first, but they're also Americans, and they're also patriots that love and have a duty to want to serve their people. When they seen an opportunity to be able to help in a way that they were not allowed to, they were willing to work with us. And I think this was a scenario where you just seen Americans helping Americans for humans to help humans, and people just wanted to do the right thing. And so I think it was a very uncommon scenario. If I was a military guy on a normal base and some civilians showed up and said, hey, I'm here to help, I'd be like, yeah, go away. But this scenario was just so different.
And this is the crazy thing. And anybody in the military, understand that has ever been in the military appreciates this to the nth degree. It was so up there. It was so desperate that they were like, yeah, cool. Like, here's a hangar. They gave us a hangar. They gave us a ramp. They let us land, 5 airframes over and over and over again. And there was like, it wasn't like, hey, let's get you approved or anything. It was just like, hey, you're Nick. I know you from the internet. Thanks for coming. I'm telling you, man, like this dude, total badass, ground forces guy. Like he was like, I know you from the internet. Thanks for coming. That was the first thing that was said to me, and I am a person, like I don't walk around pretending that I am like a cool guy. Like I am known because I made silly videos on the internet, sold t-shirts, and like I'm in this position. And like in the back of my head, I'm like, the world is a wild place. But I will tell you, like, all jokes aside, I have never seen the level of desperation that was in HKIA. It's the worst thing I've ever seen.
What Nick describes next is horrific, and I'll caution you ahead of time that what he describes is graphic and unsettling.
There was so much desperation that like people were surfing infants across the crowd the way you would like beach balls at a concert. Every once in a while, the Taliban would light some people up, outside of where the media was. And that would create like this surge of panic. And a couple times people tried to throw infants over the wall thinking there might be somebody on the other side that would catch them. And some newborns bled out in concertina wire, and I'm not talking about like for me or for our guys, because we were so busy doing that we didn't absorb a lot of that emotionally. It was like you knew these things were happening, but like you were going. But I am extremely concerned about the 6,000 troops that were stationed on that wall, because they essentially had to play God nonstop for 2 weeks. And like, if you got in, and especially in the early folks that got in, they weren't all SIVs. It was just like pandemonium. And at some point they sealed the gates and there were people inside, and that had nothing to do with us. That was just like the way it was. There were thousands of people that had been inside the gate and no one wanted to kick them out. But then after that, it was like a lot of it was very arbitrary. I mean, you had American citizens get turned away. You had people, you had one SIV holder bring in 14 people, and, none of that was in our control. But, these, and I say kids, and I don't say it with an insult. It's just that I'm now an old. And when I look at like a 19-year-old, a 20-year-old, the people that were injured at that wall, like I look at them as kids, because I have a 21-year-old, I have an ROTC 21-year-old, so like when I think about like somebody my son's age is making these decisions, like, do you get to live? Because that's fundamentally what the decision was for a lot of people. I just think it's a lot. And, I really hope that the military, NGOs, families, whoever, would proactively look out for these people. Because like what they went through, and they couldn't do anything about it. They couldn't leave the gate and go like push the Taliban back. Like they could only do something if the Taliban literally shot at them. So, it was a real bad scene.
While some of Chad's crew were working on getting Afghans onto flights, there was a parallel effort to actually get families to the airport, a very dangerous effort that required avoiding the Taliban at all costs, even if it meant wading through underground sewers filled with human waste.
Yeah, so those guys, they got into some wild situations. They got chased a few times by the Taliban. They had to basically create rat lines past not only the Taliban, but past our own troops, because they had to be undetected, because the Taliban were watching everywhere. So they ended up, one of the most effective rat lines that we had was literally through the sewer system. So they were taking these families and, by the time like they got, they linked up with us, like everyone's covered in like from the knees down. So like Tim took a picture of it and but when he finally got back to UAE, cause he just threw everything away, and he just has this picture of like this, slightly bloody, very covered pair of, sometimes we were able to, we bought buses. So we bought like 5 buses. Sometimes we were able to just drive those buses right on or right to the gate and then unload. But then other times it was like individual families, kids, whatever. And the Taliban had, OPs everywhere, like you'd leave the gate and they would start basically paralleling you. So, it was like, all right, this isn't going to work because, we weren't there for this. So this particular story like was not us. And I won't say who it was, but it was corroborated by a couple people that I spoke with that were there. They grabbed this woman that, that had worked with us, that was a well-known, women's rights activist, and they were walking her, into a U.S. vehicle. And, the Taliban yelled something at her, and she kind of broke away from the guys for a second and yelled something back, like only like 2 feet ahead of them, like they're at the doors of the vehicle and she's at like the front hood, and like they murked her right on the hood of the vehicle and basically were like daring the dudes to do something. And the guys knew that like now that it had already happened, the ROE said like there's nothing they can do. Like if they had drawn on her and them, that's a different story. But
Nick wouldn't confirm whether service members were involved in this story, but the rules of engagement he described are in line with those described having been in place during that time frame. Along with Chad's team, there were other groups and organizations led by veterans with similar pedigrees as Chad that were working to get Afghans out of the country. There was lots of cross-organization assistance and a lot of work done with the Department of Defense and the State Department. Despite the positive efforts and good intentions, there was still some criticism about American civilians being there despite their veteran status. Civilians nevertheless operating in a military environment. Chad Robichaw.
Yeah, so there's going to be the people that are looking outside and they're like, well, a bunch of just veterans, cowboys that just got on a plane and just flew into Afghanistan and did their own thing. I think if you really think about it for like 30 seconds, you'd realize that's not even possible. You can't just land. There was a lot of veterans that tried to just charter a flight and land, and they got turned away. So we had coordination. We were allowed to be there. We were accepted to be there. There were a lot of rules that they wanted us to follow. And there was a lot of disagreements, but with the State Department particularly, because for me saying they want to do it their way, they wasn't doing anything. And so we went in and we had the permissions to be there. Some people on the ground did not like the fact that we were there. Some people did. And but the fact is we were allowed to be there. We had CENTCOM approval to be there, and because of that, we were allowed to be there, and the people that we didn't want us there, we tried to avoid. The people that did want us there and wanted to work with us, we worked with them. Like I said, in 10 days, we had one incident. It was a bad incident. It probably, in my opinion, probably cost some people their lives. I don't want to make it an accusation because I can't say that for sure. But it was because of this, one individual, and I can't say who they are because it's kind of like being investigated. But it was one individual that saw what we were doing, did not like the fact that they were there, and tried to shut us down and send people away that was already safe and secure, including Americans and children.
The incident Chad's referring to would take on a life of its own on social media because at the center of it was Tim Kennedy. Tim Kennedy is a special forces soldier and a former UFC fighter, and he is controversial in some segments of the special operations community. I think probably it has more to do with his social media presence than anything. Some people just see him as a spotlighter or a showboater. And, I don't have any reason to dislike Kennedy myself or any real criticism of him. But I think, again, if you do look at his social media presence, he doesn't exactly come across as the quiet professional. And that can certainly bring a little bit of heat down on yourself.
Usually, like, Tim gets in trouble. It's because Tim, ran his mouth, and he's who he is. He is a good dude. Like, I would not be best friends with this guy if he wasn't just a great human being. And we had a mission where we loaded up 500 orphans onto buses that we purchased. We also had Christians. We had 50 American citizens. And, people say, why Christians? It's because they're persecuted and they were going to get killed. 50 American citizens and families of the crews of the Cam Air flights that were running for us. So, part of our deal with the Cam Air pilots was, we'll fly into this situation over and over again, but you get our families out. So, over the sat phone, Tim calls, we got him. Like, we have everybody, we're heading our way. And then he gets on. Now, at this point, I had just flown 400 people back to UAE. So I'm in UAE waiting for the next flight back to HKIA. But I'm talking to him on the sat phone, and he's like, I'm on base. We're good. And like, we literally in UAE, at that point, there were 7 of us there. We're like celebrating. It was the Super Bowl because we knew that we were getting close. We knew we weren't going to be able to evacuate people all the way up to the 31st deadline. We knew that. We knew it. We could feel it was closing. The window was closing. But like, that was the big win. All these kids, and this colonel sees these buses, and I try very hard not to judge people too harshly, because I don't know what he knew. The bombing happened only a few hours later. So maybe he knew there was a bomb threat. Maybe he was worried about his guys. It's not for me to say, but he lost his shit on our guys. And our guys had coordinated this. We weren't just allowed to do whatever we wanted. You know what I mean? Like, this was coordinated with State Department. And, so these buses full of kids, and American citizens, are on base, and he's like, I want them out of here. And, Tim is like, he's begging. He's like, sir, please, can we at least go through all their paperwork? There's Americans, like we have 50 American passports. And he goes to Tim, like, this isn't the Tim Kennedy show. This is my show. I was like, bro. And Tim wasn't in charge of the mission. He wasn't the team leader. So, then we get one of the other gentlemen that was part of this team, was an academy grad also. He was like, he tried that. He was like, come on, man. Cause this colonel was a class of 97 West Point guy. So I actually know him. He was there the same time I was there. And he was like, come on, man. I'm West Point. This isn't, we're not just messing around. This is who approved these people. We ran this through Joint Chiefs. This isn't, and the guy didn't care. He didn't care at all. And, I called Senator Tillis's office. Senator Tillis called a bunch of people. Then, a general officer called down to ICYMI to stop all of it. But by the time that he was able to get a hold of this guy, he had already kicked everybody out.
And so what happened from there?
I don't know. We still don't know.
With all those people?
Don't know. Yeah, it was bad. It was a real bad. It went from the best day. It went from the best day that we had there to the worst day in 5 minutes. And I just was trying like hell to figure out how this guy could do that. You know what? If you want, my thought is hey, if you want to kick Tim Kennedy and our team off the base, if you want to strip search every one of these people to make sure that they're safe, do that. But how do you look at 500 children? How do you see people waving their blue passports and go, fuck it, I don't care?
From this point, for those of us kind of on the other side of it back here in the United States, this story bounced around these sort of anonymous Instagram accounts and took on a bit of a life of its own, fairly or unfairly to Tim Kennedy.
Yeah, so there are a few accounts that just hate Tim. I love the guy. I also realize he rubs people the wrong way. I get it. He is. Everybody wants him to be the quiet professional, but he's in the Guard. He lives his life and is also in the Guard. So he is a celebrity. That's just the way it is. And so people hate that he gets to kind of live in both worlds, but that's life.
In 10 days, Chad Robichaux's group was able to evacuate 12,000 people, including American citizens. The August 26th bombing, which claimed the lives of 13 U.S. service members, would dramatically hinder civilian operations. And as the last U.S. service members left Kabul airport, Chad is now trying to continue his efforts of saving Afghans and American citizens trapped in Afghanistan.
These people had lost everything. They lost their home. They lost their ability to care for them, provide for themselves. Many of them, we told them to pack a backpack. Many of them don't even have that backpack. They have their clothes. So we have to make sure they go from a home to a new home and a new hope and a new beginning with dignity and respect. So that's why we're involved in the humanitarian process. We want to make sure the process is done right. They're treated with dignity and respect, and they're welcomed into America. So there's that piece. And then there's another piece that we have to look at moving forward, and that's our veterans. So many veterans, like I said, 77% of veterans believe that we should be helping our Afghan allies. Many of those are people who served with veterans, served in Afghanistan, and the Afghanistan community, the U.S. military Afghan community is hurt over this. Many of them are dealing with major depression because why did I serve? Why did I lose my legs? Why did I lose my friend? Did my interpreter get out? All these questions they're asking, they need help. And so as Mighty Oaks Foundation, we're really working to make sure we provide those answers, help them move forward, care for them in their mental health through this, and help them reconcile this issue. And then as well as our interpreters, when our interpreters get back, many of them interpreted for 20 years, how do we care for them and help them assimilate? So we want to make sure we care for those people as well, and be there for them as an organization at Mighty Oaks Foundation.
So there are areas where the government can help us, right now. It's tough because, we spend a lot of time with the State Department, and the people that we work with are trying very hard. We spend a lot of time with DOD, and the people that we work with are trying very hard. If the government didn't want to help, we would not exist. We would just be illegal, right? So I have a lot of appreciation for, the private-public partnership that they're allowing. I would love to see more clear support around some areas. Like, for example, can the government just provide planes? It's the number one cost that all of these NGOs are even some of these NGOs have raised serious money, but $500K a pop, like that money goes quickly, right? So can the government just provide planes? That would help.
Or waive those refugee fees. I mean, what legitimate Afghan political or war refugee can pay $575? Come on.
Nobody.
Yeah.
So, I don't want to go after the same people that are helping us. And you also have to, when you say State Department, that's a lot of different people. When you say government, that's a lot of different people. And so, Congress can act, the Senate can act. I know that there are people again, I'm not a political guy, but Senator Tillis has been awesome. Like, Senator Tillis has gone out of his way to help any way that he could. And, he has been asking nonstop for additional support. It's not a partisan thing. There hasn't been this overwhelming support from Congress. And my feeling is that if Congress isn't going to get actively involved in making this something they want to solve, then it's not going to get solved. And, I think this is where you get into media and the power of media. So, you've got people that want it to just go away on one side because, fair or unfair, it's widely considered a failure and it's getting hung around the administration's neck. Right. So then you've got the other half that is, you've got a bunch of people on the other half that are saying, we shouldn't be taking in Afghans. They're going to, create a jihad in our country, just the nonsense. I don't think anybody that is a pure politician, this isn't worth their time.
So to this day, Nick and others, people who have been involved in various evacuation efforts, Digital Dunkirk, and others, continue to have liaisons with the State Department. They do weekly Zoom calls and they do work, a lot of it behind the scenes, to help people get out of Afghanistan, to help our allies get out of Afghanistan in various ways, some catching flights out, some traveling overland, the specifics of which they certainly have the reasons for not disclosing at the moment. And in the next episode, we're going to get into some of those other parallel efforts, including so-called Pineapple Express with former Special Forces officer Scott Mann. And we are also going to be talking to Mick Mulroy, a former CIA paramilitary operations officer who was involved with Digital Dunkirk.
This episode was written and produced by Rod Rodriguez with assistance from Jack Murphy. We want to thank Catherine Putz, Chad Robichaud, and Nick Palmisciano for their time and help telling this amazing story. You can find links to their social media and to save our allies in the show notes. Don't forget to check out stripes.com for all the news that matters to you. Stars and Stripes has been there for you all over the world. Now you can read those amazing articles wherever you are by going to stripes.com and using promo code PODCAST to save 50% on your digital subscription to Stars and Stripes. That's 50% when you use promo code PODCAST. I'm Rod Rodriguez.
I'm Jack Murphy.
And we'll see you at the next episode.